Moose populations, like all wildlife, fluctuate and respond to conditions in their habitats. But last year, Ontario's Environmental Commissioner flagged declining moose population as something that should give us pause even beyond those natural cycles. Joining us now to examine the matter of Ontario's moose, Dennis Murray, biology professor and Canada Research Chair in Integrative Wildlife Conservation at Trent University. Welcome.
Thanks very much.
It's very nice to have you here, Dennis.
It's my pleasure.
Before we start talking about moose, I was hoping that you could help us distinguish some of the terminology. With moose, what's a bull, a cow, and a calf?
Right, so a bull would be an adult male, a cow is an adult female, and a calf would be a young, either male or female animal that was born that year.
And to get into our conversation, I'd like to read something with some numbers. In northern and central Ontario, one of the most important species is the moose. Moose have great cultural and economic significance for many Ontario communities, particularly for First Nations and in the north. And who could forget paddling around a corner to see a magnificent bull moose shaking his antlers in the shallows? But what many don't know is that Ontario's moose are in trouble. The moose population in Ontario has declined by about 20% over the last decade. Some regions of the province have seen severe drops in the 50 to 60% range. Wow. Should we be concerned by those figures?
Absolutely, very much so, yes. That's a big problem with moose, not only in Ontario, but beyond. It's very, very serious. Yeah.
Moose aren't pack animals, they're solitary animals.
For the most part, yes.
And how do scientists track them?
So typically, if we're trying to do a study on moose and understand what's happening to their populations, we'll try to capture the animals and put radio collars on them. So the radio collars allow us to figure out where the animals are moving, as well as monitor their survival and behavior, their reproductive activities, those kind of things.
Any idea of how many are out there in Ontario?
With radio collars right now, I think that there are none, in fact. There may be a very small number, but we conducted the last large moose study in Ontario, in Algonquin Park a few years ago, where we had about 80 or 90 animals with radio collars at one point in time. But right now in Ontario, I think it's not very many.
Isn't that surprising? If there's a decline in moose, wouldn't we want to know why?
Yes, but we have to keep in mind that it's very, very expensive to conduct these kind of studies. So these radio collars are very expensive. It's also very expensive to capture the animals and then to monitor them subsequently. So those are the challenges that biologists are faced. If they're trying to understand the mechanisms and the causes of a decline, well, there's the need for money to actually be put into the project, and sometimes it's quite difficult to obtain that money.
Has this decline been going on long, the population of moose?
Certainly, if we look at the Ontario data, so on the province of Ontario censuses moose on a yearly basis, we understand that the population decline has been going on for several years, for sure. And as I said, it's also happening elsewhere.
Where else is it happening?
Certainly Quebec and Manitoba, British Columbia, to some extent Alberta and Saskatchewan. In the northwestern United States, there's been declines pretty much across the board, mostly in the southern distribution of the species. That's where the populations are most well known, where we have a better sense of what's happening to them on a year-by-year basis. And it's pretty well understood that across the board in their southern edge of their distribution, there have been declines.
Beyond that, like them being in the southern area, is there any other thing that links them?
I think most biologists agree at this point that climate change is probably playing a major role in the decline of moose. Moose are really adapted for sort of a boreal existence of, forest, temperate forests where there's cold temperature in the winter, and they're very large, so it's difficult for them to stay cool in the summer. And through a number of means, it seems like climate change is having deleterious effects on moose.
And if you said in the warmer temperature, it's difficult for them, what happens when it gets colder?
So when it gets colder, I think moose do better. Like they like relatively cool time periods. In the summer when it's very, very warm, they'll seek shelter either in wetlands or in forested areas, but they have difficulty in maintaining their body temperature when it's very, very warm. So they're not well adapted to those warm conditions that we're seeing increasingly due to climate change.
And while moose are declining, there's another species that's increasing. Can you tell us about the white-tailed deer?
Right, so very much so. So this would be sort of an indirect effect of climate change. Due to climate change, the white-tailed deer populations are increasing. White-tailed deer are spreading northward, whereas previously they were pretty much isolated to the southern part of North America.
Why are they going north?
Because there's less snow. When there's less snow, the deer are able to survive winter much better. And that allows them to move northwards, and so their range is expanding quite substantially. Now they're coming in closer contact with moose, and this closer contact is leading to the exchange of parasites that are not all that deleterious to deer, but that are quite invasive and problematic for moose.
But moose are from the deer family, right?
They are.
So why are they affecting moose so much?
So because moose did not co-evolve with those parasites. So what's happened is over thousands, if not millions of years, white-tailed deer and those parasites have co-evolved to the point where the white-tailed deer has an immune system response that's able to withstand infections by those parasites. Moose do not have that immune system response. It's not as well refined when they get infected with those parasites, and so therefore they either succumb to mortality directly, or they become highly debilitated and then perhaps succumb to predation or other causes.
And this has been kind of compared, I read some things, it was compared to what happens to cows with mad cow disease. So what is the parasite? What does it do to the moose?
So there are 3 different parasites. One is called a winter tick, which is an invertebrate, an insect. It infests the moose, and it basically parasitizes the skin and chews and saps blood. And so what happens then is that the moose tries to scratch to get rid of the ticks and breaks off all of its guard hairs, to the point where sometimes when a moose is heavily infected and still alive, you might see this moose in the forest that looks like what people used to call a ghost moose. It's a white moose that's broken off all of its guard hairs in trying to scrape off the winter ticks. So
But moose usually have ticks, right?
they do, but a different species. So the one that we're talking about right now is called the deer tick, and it infects moose. The moose are not well adapted to withstanding that tick. There are other ticks in the environment that are less invasive to moose than this one.
And the moose's behavior changes too, it becomes erratic with these ticks?
Right. So it loses basically a sense of direction sometimes. It'll just be preoccupied with trying to scrape off these ticks, and it might, forage in places where it wouldn't forage otherwise. It probably loses its ability to make sound decisions, thereby making it more vulnerable to predation and things like that.
So you said that's one, and what are the other two?
So the other one is called the meningeal worm. It's a worm that infects the moose and moves its way up into the brain. And when a moose gets infected with that parasite, moose lose coordination. They lose their ability to walk in a straight line. And what you'll see is, like, for example, when people fly overhead in the winter, they might see tracks of moose that are going around in a circle. That's characteristic of a moose that has this meningeal worm, or this brain parasite.
And the other one is in the liver?
The other one is in the liver, yes.
What does that do?
And that one basically just chews up the liver. It creates a large number of holes in the liver. The moose tries to wall off those parasites by creating this cyst in the liver. And if it has many of these what are called flukes in the liver, it'll create many, many cysts to the point where the entire liver becomes basically one very hard cyst.
So I'm assuming that all these conditions must be very painful for the moose.
One would assume, yeah.
Is there anything that can be done to help a moose once it's infected with those
I mean,
parasites?
I suppose if we went to extreme measures, we might be able to administer a drug to kill off the parasites. And it's been tried a little bit experimentally. People are curious to find out the extent to which they're able to get rid of an infestation of ticks, for example, by administering a drug to moose and seeing whether or not it's effective. But I think from a practical perspective, it would be very difficult to apply across a broader landscape to a population of moose.
Let's discuss some of the other factors that could be affecting Ontario's moose population. Should we think that predators are killing more moose now than they have in the past?
So predators are certainly important. They certainly do kill moose. There's no real reason to believe that the predators are more important to moose mortality now than they were historically. I think it's very easy to blame predators. They're an easy scapegoat. But I don't have any evidence suggesting that the amount of predation now is higher than it would have been historically.
How about a human population?
So there's certainly human harvest. Every year, there's 5,000 or so moose that get shot through hunting. I don't think that amount of hunting, it's probably about 5% of the population in the province. I don't think that level is necessarily what's tipping the balance either. I mean, it's certainly contributing to the decline, as is predation, but to say that that's a smoking gun is maybe an exaggeration.
But how about us encroaching in their habitat, like building roads? Would that have an effect?
Yeah, so very much so. So moose, they like the boreal forest. They like continuous forest where that's not very well disturbed. The more roads there are, the more conversion there is of forest to agricultural lands, the more the forest gets broken up, makes it less hospitable to moose. And the other thing that happens is when we create these roads or other corridors in the forest, it allows predators to move into these areas. It also allows hunters to move into areas that might be very difficult to access under normal circumstances, and that would increase the mortality rate due to predation or due to hunting.
Because moose have nowhere to hide.
Well, that's it. They're essentially running out of habitat, especially in the southern part of their distribution.
But if there's a decline, wouldn't you think that it would be logical to just stop hunting for moose completely?
I suppose you could, but with an increase of 5% per year. So let's say we stop hunting altogether, and hunting removes 5% per year. Let's say. I don't know if that would be enough to completely save moose from the downward spiral that they're undergoing right now. Certainly, it would help. But the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that quite often the people that hunt are strong supporters of conservation and protection of species. And if we alienate that group of citizens, it could be that we lose a large segment of the population that's really hoping that we can do something to sustain and save moose.
And it's also economically important for those people, right?
Very much so, yes.
Of all the factors that you've mentioned, what do you think has the greatest effect on the decline in moose?
It's very difficult to say because we don't have good numbers on these various causes. But I would say that overall climate change is probably the main contributor, either directly because it's causing heat stress to the animals and they're dying or they're not able to produce at a very high rate, or through these indirect means that we discussed previously related to white-tailed deer and the parasites.
Worst case scenario, if moose entirely disappeared from Ontario, how would that affect our ecosystem?
Well, it would certainly affect the ecosystem quite substantially. I don't think that we're there yet. It's not like we're looking at moose going extinct in Ontario, certainly not in the relatively near future.
How far do you think?
Very difficult to say. Some of our own work suggests that there are going to be gaps in the distribution of moose. There will be areas where we just don't find moose anymore, say in the next 50 to 70 years. But to say that they're going to be extinct in Ontario, I think that that's an exaggeration.
Which areas do you think?
Just south of James Bay, all the way down to the edge of the boreal forest. I think that that's the region where they are the most vulnerable right now. So what, in fact, we're predicting is you may have populations of moose to the east and populations to the west, but that there's a gap just south of James Bay, and there's no longer any connection between those two moose populations.
How would Ontario's Indigenous peoples be affected by continuing decline in the moose population?
That's a very good question. Certainly, historically, the moose has been very, very important to our Aboriginal people, and that's certainly something that we need to respect. Again, as I said, there are treaty rights, there are constitutional requirements that we need to respect, and certainly many aspects of their culture is centered around moose hunting, sharing of the harvest with the community, and we need to respect those things.
Do you think the people know that there's a risk of it disappearing?
No, I don't think so. I think that that's something that we, in our daily lives, we become a little bit isolated to that. We don't see it on a day-to-day basis that moose are dying. And so it's easy for us to kind of forget that there are victims of climate change that are basically unseen.
What can be done to help Ontario's moose?
Yeah, so that's a very difficult question. I mean, there's sort of the small scale thing. We can try to understand better what's going on with moose populations. That would require detailed studies, as we described previously, putting radio collars, understanding where these animals are moving, what are they dying from, those kinds of things. Unfortunately, those studies, as we said, are very expensive, and we need to be able to maintain those studies over long periods of time. Too often, we've got funding for 2 years, 3 years, and we do a short-term study, but that doesn't really give us an insight as to what are the mechanisms driving the system. So we need to understand what are the mechanisms, and that would be achieved by conducting more detailed research on the ground. But more broadly, I think for the public, I think it's important for us to let our elected officials understand that moose is important to us. Moose, as a representative of the health of the forested ecosystem in Ontario, is important to us. And therefore, we would like to see, strong commitments towards investment in green technology and reducing CO2 emissions so that we can try to abate climate change, because we're never going to eliminate climate change altogether, but if we can slow down the gradual process of climate change, then it's quite possible that in future generations, the moose will stand a better chance of sustaining itself than it would seem right now.
Is the provincial government doing enough, do you think, now?
Well, the provincial government certainly invests a lot in moose management and moose research. That there's no doubt, probably more so than other jurisdictions in Canada. Can more be done? Absolutely, yes.
Are other jurisdictions doing things that we could learn from?
To be honest with you, I think that Ontario is pretty much at the forefront. There's very, very extensive survey work conducted on it every year in different areas of Ontario. They fly around and they look for moose to try to help them estimate the abundance of moose on the ground. They do that in a much greater detail with much more rigor than most other jurisdictions. So certainly the province cannot be faulted in terms of trying to monitor moose. They do a very good job of that. But in terms of understanding the mechanisms, that's the more detailed work involving study of the animals themselves. There could be more done there by Ontario as well as other jurisdictions.
In recent years, the provincial government has reduced the length of the moose hunting season and the number of moose tags available. Would you like to see more moose hunting reforms?
I think that for the short term, what's been done is appropriate. I think what we need to do is we need to follow through for a few years, see how that changes the harvest rates, see whether or not it has an impact on maybe abating the decline in moose to some extent. And then after we've got enough data, we can make an informed decision as to how to follow up with that, either by changing the seasons or reverting back to what they were previously. It really depends. I mean, it really needs to be a policy that's driven by data. So rather than impose changes to the harvest regime in one year and then do a knee-jerk response the following year, I think it's much more valuable to follow these things through for several years so that we have enough data that we can make informed policy decisions subsequently.
I mentioned the Ontario Federation of Hunters and Anglers, and they've been very active on this file, and they don't think hunting is the main cause of declining moose. How do you get them to think of it differently?
Well, I do think that there's a large contingent of Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters people who feel that there's a cause for concern. And they certainly do have a conservation ethic. I mean, it's not in their best interest to see local extinction of moose populations, because then that defeats the purpose of them going back to these areas year after year trying to harvest moose. I mean, it's really not in their best interest. So I don't think that there's a lack of understanding necessarily, certainly not at the executive level, but I think more and more, if we can just remind people that there are problems with moose populations, that we need to be vigilant, that we need to follow through with changes in harvest strategies, collect the data, analyze those data the best we can, and then using that information to inform future decisions. I think that, over time, if we can just convey that information back to the public, that will help garner sort of the mindset that's needed for large segments of the population to be concerned about the status of moose.
And now some think that moose hunting by Indigenous people should be regulated, which it isn't currently. What do you think about that? Well,
that's a very difficult question. It's outside my field of expertise. I'm an ecologist, I'm not a sociologist. It would be nice to know what are the Aboriginal harvest rates. I don't know if those data would be forthcoming or not, but it would be nice to know how substantive that is.
And I was just thinking that when people hunt for moose and for Indigenous people, if the moose are infected with these parasites, does it affect the meat? Does it affect?
That's a fair question.
Yeah.
No, there's no evidence that those parasites are transmitted to humans. So they're found, as we talked about those two worms, two species of worms earlier. One's in the brain, the other one's in the liver. Most people are not eating either brains or livers. And furthermore, when we're cooking the meat, these parasites are killed off anyway.
Should we be trying to control the populations of moose predators such as wolves and bears?
So that very rarely works. I know that the province of Ontario had suggested that this might be a possibility. They had entertained a plan to potentially regulate predators more extensively. And as we said earlier, it's easy for predators to be the scapegoat, to blame predators when we're not able to really ascribe any other reason for the decline other than climate change, which is very nebulous. So yes, the predators are responsible. That's just human nature to blame the predators, but it's very, very difficult to control predators successfully. I think in the literature, in the wildlife literature, it's been done successfully only in cases where, for example, on islands where you can basically exterminate the predators. There's no chances of new predators coming in. Under those circumstances, you might be able to get rid of predators to the point where it would benefit moose. But across the vast landscapes, you kill off predators in one area, and the chances are that they are replaced by new predators the following year. So it's very difficult to do.
And if there's less moose for predators like wolves and bears, how does that affect them?
Very good question. So it's possible that it could have some impact. So, because certainly when a wolf pack kills a moose, there's a lot of food there for the adults. There's a lot of food there for the juveniles to eat and sustain themselves. With the absence of moose or the decline in moose numbers, there may be a deterioration in their ability to get the food that they're looking for. On the other hand, if moose are being replaced by white-tailed deer, if they're using the same sort of habitats, certainly a white-tailed deer is a lot smaller than a moose, so there's less food there, but to some extent that can compensate for the loss of moose.
Are you hopeful about the future of moose in Ontario?
I can't help but be hopeful because otherwise I would not be in the business that I'm in. But with that said, I understand what's happening with the climate, and I've sort of seen the long-term forecasts, and things are going to change. There's no doubt. There's no doubt that things are going to change. But by trying to do something in terms of controlling our greenhouse gas emissions now, it may be that over the long term, things may not be as bleak as we might be led to believe at this point.
Dennis, thank you for being here and helping us understand what's happening with moose.
It's been my pleasure.
I was crying when I was reading this stuff. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.